across the hallway was a Daf Yomi. So I'd see you guys going in there. I don't know what you were doing there. I thought you were playing maybe poker or I don't know, rummy cube.
We were imbibing illegal drugs. All right. Anyway, good morning, everybody. Let me bring up an interesting point that we're going to see now in just a minute in the halacha. We said that if you want to save a life, you can justify stealing but you still have to have the intention of paying it back. Here's an interesting halacha in the Shulchan Aruch that I want to share with you. And let's see here. Just give me a moment. Here we go. It's a halacha in the Shulchan Aruch in the laws of laborers. Okay. Excuse me. And it's another Ramah. And the Ramah states as follows. Halokeach, I don't know if can everyone see this? Let me just maybe I should make the screen just a little bit bigger. With the font general display. Hebrew font. Let's make that 12. Let's see if that makes a difference. There we go. That's a little bit better, huh? Okay. So the Ramah says as follows. That if a person just takes his friend's animal and works with it, and his intention is to compensate him for the use of his animal. So this is a person who's borrowing without permission, and that is by definition a gazlan. In other words, you can't say, well, I'm not stealing it, I'm just borrowing it. Because when you borrow something without permission, that's also called stealing. Now, so if I borrow my friend's car, for example, without asking permission, I'm also a gazlan. Now, so I've committed a Torah violation. How do I make restitution? I give him back his car, but I'm still called a rasha if I did something like that. Now, ve'im hachamor omeid liskor lo havi gazlan. If, however, the animal had a for rent sign on it, and I go ahead and take it with the intention of paying for it, so then I'm not a gazlan. However, umihu imichubo b'nei veso v'amru shabalach mor tzarich lechamoro havi kishalomi das v'havi gazlan. But that's only under normal circumstances. But if the people who are there, let's say the family members of the owner, say, hey, you can't take that animal, even though it says for rent, but the guy needs it and it's not available for rent today, and don't take it, and he takes it anyway, so then you're also a gazlan. And then he comes up with the relevant points. But if a person comes along and he says, I need this animal to save a certain asset, right? To save a certain asset of mine. Let's say the example, we'll see an example in just a minute, but I need a vehicle in order to save my assets. And so I'm just going to borrow this guy's animal or his car in order to save something. Here, there's no life at danger. It's just a question of saving an asset. V'rotza litain lebal hachamor hetzedo lo havi gazlan, the Tanai based in who? Kidlael simin reish samach daled sifhei. He says, as long as you're willing to pay, you're not a gazlan. And the reason is because this was instituted by Beis Din. And what do we mean by this was instituted by Beis Din? So the Sama, who's the commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, says, Perish, kol shepaga bo hezek pitom, that if a person is faced with immediate damage, which means, like, in other words, all of a sudden, out of the blue, he's about to lose $1 million, right? So, and the only way he can stop it is if he acts with absolute immediacy. So, hisna based in sharashus biyadu likach kelev shel chaveru lahatzil el es shalo, v'nosin lachaveru schar hakli b'chol kayotze bazeh. So the based in says that you're allowed to take your friend's property and use it to save your own property, even if in the end you'll end up causing damage to your friend's property. Nonetheless, as long as you can pay him for it, then you're allowed to do that. And I refer you, he says, to before in the Shulchan Aruch in Reish Samech Daled. So what does the Shulchan Aruch say in Reish Samech Daled? The Shulchan Aruch says as follows. The Shulchan Aruch says, if two people were walking on the street, one guy's carrying a barrel of wine or a container of wine, the other fellow's carrying a container of honey. And all of a sudden a leak springs in the guy's honey container. And before the honey spills out entirely, the guy with the wine spills out his wine because the honey is more expensive than the wine. And he says, here, quickly, pour your honey into my bottle. He's entitled to compensation, but not for the cost of the wine, but rather for his labor. But if he offers to him, if you want, I can spill out my wine if you pay for it so that I can save your expensive honey. Or if you made that condition in front of Beis Din, so then if the guy agrees to it, he would have to compensate him. And the owner of the wine, in many instances, is obligated. If the guy says to him, I'll pay you for the wine if you spill it out because I need to save my expensive honey, then according to some poskim, it's his obligation to do so. Okay, so that's the that's the basic halacha. Okay, so that is the basic halacha, and that's what we were referring to over here. Now, so based on that, the Beis Din gives you a right to steal or to borrow without permission somebody's item, even though someone's life is not at stake. Now, up until now, all we've seen is that you're allowed to steal in order to save a life. Here, we're saying even more than that you're allowed to steal apparently, even if it's not to save someone's life, but you're faced with an immediacy, like an urgent matter facing a loss of assets. You're allowed to take someone else's object without their permission, which is a form of stealing, in order to save your asset. This is based on a tshuva from the Trumas Hadeshen, which is a early medieval responsum. And he writes the following, She'elah, here's the question. Reuven hayalo sus beveso v'yatza l'shuk. Reuven has a horse in his house, and he leaves for the marketplace, leaves his horse at home. Ubash Shimon lebeso shel Reuven v'lokach hasus lirkov alav maher, avor chov echad shimlo yirkov ata avuro yehi bevadai nifsad. And Shimon bursts into Reuven's house or his barn, wherever the horse is, takes the horse without Reuven's permission to ride to a place where he needs to pay back a debt And if he doesn't pay it back today, he stands to lose a huge amount of money. In other words, apparently there's a huge penalty if he doesn't pay it back today. So he takes, and he doesn't have a way of getting there fast enough because he doesn't have his own horse. So he takes, what this question reminded me of is, like on those TV shows where a cop says, we need to impound your vehicle, police emergency. And then, and sometimes it's done by a guy who's not a police officer, but he pretends to be a police officer. We're impounding your vehicle, citizens, whatever it's called, we're impounding your vehicle. Why? Because they have an emergency. So this is an emergency. We're taking your vehicle. And I need to save myself from a huge financial loss. And I'm going to save myself 100 litrin. I don't know what happened, but that seems to be a lot of money. And Shimon does not have any other source, a horse available. So Amra Eishes Ruven l'Shimon al tikach hasus klal ki bali gam kein tzorach lirkov alav miyad abor esek echad sheyesh lo yimnachri echad. And the wife of Ruvain, she's in the house. She sees what Shimon is doing. She says, "Don't take my husband's horse, because he also has business today that he needs to conduct with a non-Jew, and he needs his horse to get there." And she says to him, if you take that horse, then he's going to lose out on this business opportunity and he's going to lose a lot of money. So Amar Shimon, Kamahu ha'esek yud litrin. So Shimon says to the woman, he says, well, how much would he stand to lose if he doesn't take the horse? And she says, yud litrin. She says he's going to lose 10 litrin. And Shimon says, I'm going to lose 100 litrin. So anit tzarich lasus hazeh abor kuf litrin Ephraim miyad leruvein asar litrin ha'isek shelo im yehi nifsad ve'ekachasus. And so Shimon says, listen, I'm happy to pay the 10 litrin that your husband's going to lose out by not being able to use his horse. I need to save myself 100 litrin. So it's worth it for me to compensate your husband if he's going to lose out. V'chein lokach oso al manas lifro gam kein scharo. And he says, and furthermore, I'll pay the wages for the horse rental on top of the 10 litrin. And then, so he takes the horse, and lo and behold, the horse dies on Shimon when he's on somewhere on the road. So chayiv l'shalim Shimon demei hasus l'Ruven olo. So does Shimon have an obligation to pay the rent to Ruvain or not? That's the question. Now, so the Trumas Hadeshin was posed with this question, and basically, when the halacha is that when you borrow something, you are responsible for the animal's death if the animal dies. But if you rent an animal and the animal dies, you're not responsible for the loss of the animal if it just dies on the road, if it onus. It's the same thing with car rentals. When you rent a car, so if you borrow your friend's car, and we'll learn about this if we ever get to the laws of borrowing and renting, which is in Choshen Mishpat as well. But if you borrow your friend's car, you assume all responsibility for any mishap, even if you get into an accident that was not your fault. By borrowing a person's vehicle, you are responsible for any mishap that occurs. When you rent a car, you're only responsible for acts of negligence, but you're not responsible if the car just dies or if someone else hits the car. Okay, so anyway, that's at least according to Jewish law. I'm not going to tell you what it is when you rent a car. A lot of times the car rental places will hold you liable if you park your car in a parking lot and someone just comes and crashes into it. They will still hold you liable for that. So anyway, Shuva, here's the response. It would seem at first glance obvious that that Reuven is liable to pay for the horse's death. Since the wife, Mrs. Reuven, had told Shimon My husband does not want you to take the horse. He doesn't want to rent it out. He needs the horse for himself. Imkain havi Shimon sachir shalom midas v'nichra gazlan. So if so, then Shimon has taken the horse without permission, and he's called a gazlan. Kamo shol shalom midas the maishna. Just like even if you're willing to rent an animal or to lease an animal, but it's against the owner's will, you're just as much of a gazlan if you borrow it against his will. Since Reuven is not happy with leasing out the horse. But maybe you'll argue that no, the whole reason that Reuven doesn't want to rent out his horse is because he's going to lose money on this deal that he has with this non-Jew. And Shimon has promised to compensate him for the loss of that deal. But you're still called a gazlan. Kidigarsin perikakones. Mahu liichlufe sorim de Yisrael ba'adashim de plishtim kidei lahachilas behemto. Umefarish asam ba'ashiri da adashim adifi misorim tvei. The Gemara asks the question: can I take, let's say, barley from a Jew, and without his consent, replace his barley with lentils? And lentils are more valuable than barley. But my animal won't eat barley. My animal will only eat lentils. So I'm going to take a bag of lentils, which is worth more than the bag of barley, and I'll swap it with my friend unbeknownst to him against his will. And the Gemara says you're not allowed to do that. The Gemara says you're not allowed to, even if you're giving someone something more valuable than what you're taking from him, you can't do that without his permission, unbeknownst to him. V'hu adinido didan nami, demali im natal mamun chaver shalomidatu al menas l'shalim, umali im mekalkel al menas l'shalim. Sharei esek shel Reuven bevadei haya mekulkal v'nifsadim lo yirkav hayom. He says it makes no difference whether you take your friend's money or whether you spoil his business deal. Just because you're willing to pay him for it does not make you any less of a gazlan. Amnam ki daikinan matzinu lemeimar delo mikri gazlan ke agavna b'lekichas asus ba'adarabba birshus based in notla. But on the other hand, says the Trumas Hadeshin, there is another way of looking at it, which is that the Beis Din apparently will sometimes give you permission when you have an imminent loss of assets. You're allowed to take your friend's property in order to save your assets. The Tanan beperik meruba Rabbi Shmuel ben Shel Yochanan ben Baroka Omar Tanai Beis Din hu shemnista kalechad chavish shel davash, that the Beis Din has made a sort of like a stipulation on the general population that if a guy's walking around with a container of honey, which is very expensive, that you do have a right to grab your friend's bottle of wine, spill out his wine, and pour your honey into it in order to save your honey. You just have to pay him for the wine. And you can even if he's yelling at you and saying, I don't want you to use my wine bottle. I want my wine. I don't care if you're willing to pay me for it. I still don't want you to, I'm not interested in helping save your honey. But nonetheless, according to Tosfos, you can even actually coerce him to relinquish his bottle. You can impound his vehicle against his will, right? It's the same. So therefore, maybe you can make the argument over here too, that I need your husband's horse. I'll pay him for whatever loss he's going to incur by not having the horse for today, but I need to save my assets. So why don't you say the same thing over here? Let me just see. So therefore, I would argue he says the same thing should apply over here. One second. Right. The only time that we would say that destroying someone else's property is called a rasha is when you're not doing it to save your own property. The achi haygavna lo hisnu beistin, because that's not when the beistin gives you permission. And he says, "Va'afal gav de Rav Ilfas usmag paspa deloka Rabbi Shmuel ben Oshel B'Yochanan ben Baroka ba'ashiri dachi rayo shel Rav Ilfas." And even though there's a machlokas as to whether we paskin like that Gemara, whether we do say that you can coerce someone to relinquish their wine in order to save your honey, but nonetheless, the Rosh paskins like it. Uvetur Choshen kasav behedja da'ashri pasuk Rabbi Yochanan v'chein kasav bar zarud Rabbi Chanina pasuk Rabbi Yochanan. The Gam Rav Yadacha Rayas the Rav Ilfas. It basically goes through the different sources. He says, mashma midivrehim, but according to a whole group of other commentaries, the pligi nami atanai beistin velo midina mishum dezenena lechud kamo shiratza shirilomer peragogos obasr lefiza mishlama halacha kerabana. He says, based on the fact that there's a big argument about this, and he brings a whole bunch of commentaries who say that we don't paskin this way, that you cannot save your honey by destroying his wine. And he basically leaves it off as it's a machlokes. It's going to be a machlokes that if you paskin that you're allowed to save your honey by spilling out the guy's wine even against his will, as long as you're willing to pay him for the wine. So then in our case, if Shimon grabs Reuven's horse and rides off with it, so then it'll turn out that Shimon had permission to do so, because the Beis Din gives a person permission to use someone else's assets to save his property. So in this case, he was legally within his rights to rent the horse, and therefore he is a regular renter. And if the animal dies, then he just, since he was within his rights as a renter to take the horse, he's not responsible for ones, for a mishap of death that occurs to the horse. But if you paskin like the Rif, that you don't have a right to save your honey by forcing the other guy to spill out his wine, so then Shimon was not within his rights to appropriate Reuven's horse, and therefore, if a mishap happened to the horse, Shimon would have to pay for the entire value of the horse, right? So, in addition to compensating Reuven for the loss of his deal, and the Trumas Hadeshin essentially basically says it's a machlokus in the poskin, and he is not prepared, I guess, to rule how what the law will be in that particular case, but it certainly stands to reason that whenever we have a machlokus like this and it's an unresolved machlokus, many times the Beis Din will just say, well, then split the difference and pay for half the horse or whatever, So the bottom line is that this is a huge discussion. If you hold that you're allowed to spill out your friend's wine in order to save your honey, cause him damage, or take his property so that you can save your own assets, then why does the Rav Shulchan Aruch over here only say that you're allowed to steal someone else's assets in order to save a life? Don't we see that sometimes you're allowed to steal even if it's less than life-saving, even if it's just to save something of yours? So this is an important discussion. And if you take a look at the Imrei Yaakov, let me just stop this share screen and go to the, hold on a second. Give me a moment, please. So now if we go to the Imrei Yaakov, he says in Sif Katan Tes Zayin as follows: Asar afil al das l'shalom. You're not allowed to steal another person's assets unless it's for life saving. The Gemara Yalif Lamidichsiv Chavol Resha Gezela Yishalom. It's based on a pasuk that says that when you damage someone else's property, it's an act of evil, and you have to pay back for the gezel that you have committed. Berod Salomar, Afagav de Gazela, Yishalem, Rasha Mikri. And what we infer from that pasuk is, even when you steal with the intention of paying a person back for what you've stolen, you're still called a Rasha. Okay, Yesh Omrim, but that notwithstanding, there are those who say, Di'impagabo hezek shaba pitom, that if a person is faced with an all of a sudden kind of sudden financial loss, and he needs to save it, because if he doesn't act quickly, he will incur a huge loss. So in that kind of scenario, you're allowed to take your friend's property and use it to save your property, and just compensate him for the usage of his property. The Tanai based in who? And this is what we call a Tanai based in, something that was stipulated by the based in for urgent matters. So it seems like this. It seems like the standard law is that you're only allowed to steal in order to save a life when there's no immediacy to the situation. But when there's a certain immediacy to the situation, that I am going to assume that this guy will be willing to help me, provided that I compensate him for taking his object, but I don't have time to wait to ask him, because if I take the time to wait, I'm going to lose my asset. I'm going to incur a financial loss. So then, under those kinds of limited circumstances, you would be allowed to impound his property without his knowledge, as long as you're willing to pay him afterwards. And then you can apologize later and pay him whatever he feels is a reasonable price for the use of his property. So I just wanted to point that out, because it's a big caveat, right? Because really what we're basically giving you a heter to do is, there could be certain scenarios where, even if it's not for the purpose of saving a life, you would be allowed to steal someone's property temporarily, as long as you're willing to pay for it. In his biurim, Rav Stern writes, it could also be that you're only allowed to do this when you actually have cash on hand to compensate him. And the difference is that in the halacha that we're dealing with now, you're allowed to save a life by stealing your friend's property, even if it costs a huge amount of money that you don't have, and you don't know whether you'll ever have it. So you can steal a drug, for example, that's it's $100,000 drug, and you don't have that kind of money. We can justify you stealing it as long as you intend to pay it back, even though it's unlikely that you'll ever be able to get those assets you'll ever be able to pay him for it. But here we're saying that you're allowed to steal someone or borrow someone's property without their permission. But in this scenario, to save your own assets, when it's not life-saving, will only be permitted if you actually have the money to pay him. You can't say, oh, I'll get the money somehow, and then never come up with it. Here, you mamish have to have cash in hand in order for this heter to work. Okay, any questions, comments?
Now, Rabbi, going back to the idea about taking the horse. So it would seem that it's possible that the cost of the horse would be maybe more than the whole loan that would be needed. So I would imagine it was very expensive to have a horse. So right. I'm surprised that there would be a machloket there. Like, if you take it and something happens to the horse, I would think it should definitely be a responsibility. And who's going to be the one to judge whether you drove that horse too hard to make it that horse had a heart attack or whatever? So,
so you're asking two separate questions. The first question is, you took the horse without permission. Of course, you should be liable. So the response is as follows. So the response to the first question is that if Shimon was within his legal rights to borrow that horse, and he's already stipulated that he's going to pay whatever the lease costs on that horse are, so then he becomes a regular leaser of property, because the horse was meant to be leased out. It was a leasing horse. That was part of the statement of the Trumas Hadeshin in this responsum. He says, since the horse was meant to be leased out anyway, The only issue over here is that he took it without permission, but the Beis Din gives him permission to take it without permission when he has this emergency financial situation. If so, he immediately becomes like any other leaser of property. And when you lease a horse, if the horse dies of natural causes without any fault of your own as the user of the horse, so then the halacha is that you don't have to pay for the death of the horse. So that's the reason why he would not be liable to pay. And remember, the Trumas Hadeshin left it off as it's a machlokes. If he didn't have permission to take the horse, then he's certainly going to be liable to pay for the death of the horse. But if he has permission according to halacha to take the horse, and the horse dies through natural means, not through any negligence or any nefarious act of the renter, so then he doesn't have to pay for the horse's death. Now, the second question that you asked was, how are you able to verify that he didn't overwork the horse and it didn't die of a heart attack? So to answer that question, you'll have to do some forensic analysis of, I'm not sure, I'm not a vet, but I would imagine that when they do the autopsy on the horse, they'll be able to verify whether the horse was overworked or not. They'll look at the foam at its mouth, they'll look at all of the other forensics, and they'll be able to make a determination, how did this horse die? Did it die because of old age, or did it die because it was overworked? If it died because it was overworked, then that's a negligent act of the renter, and the renter will be responsible to pay. But if it died of natural causes, or let's say the horse got struck by lightning, right? And there's no way for me to stop that. We were in the middle of a rainstorm and I hitched the horse to a post and a lightning bolt came and struck the horse, or struck the post, which struck the horse. So then it's clear that it wasn't because I overworked the horse. It was an act of God. And that I'm not responsible to pay for. Okay? So we'll hold it here for today.